where do I need to track the knees when squatting? Where do the hips need to go as you're going through a phase of the squat? So that's what I'm going to cover with you guys today. Most importantly, I think whenever people are going into the squat, so they're descending and they're going down into the squat, external rotation bias is really important because you want to be able to sink down in the squat. You need to be able to open the hips up. I think what a lot of people end up going wrong is they end up transitioning forward. So they end up going too far into their knees. They don't open their hips and they don't adequately sink into the hip joint. Now, whenever the hips open up and you get down to the bottom, you don't necessarily want to overly externally rotate and get too far out, but you do want to create space so that you can actually get into the space of your hip and your pelvis. And then as you're going to ascend, when you're going to push up, I usually find a place where I start pushing in. Now, some people will overly accentuate that, and that's a lot of times when you see elite weightlifters, they'll get a big, huge valgus knee collapse, which is the knee going inwards. And that'll track the knee really far over to the inside, which is potentially can be a really good thing because you're finding the midline stabilizers, your adductors, and some other major muscles that are going to drive that primary movement out of the squat. But this could potentially cause issues if your knees are getting too much rotation and torque as you're going to push through that movement. So a lot of times I like to find a space where I can open up my hips, drive the knee slightly in to find midline, which is creating internal rotation in the hips to push out. And then there's a phase where it starts to transition back to external rotation as you go to extend through the hips and open up and squeeze out of that squat. Now the problem is if the hips go in when you're going down, so we internally rotate, what you'll have is you just run out of room. You just have nowhere to go in the hips. You want to externally rotate, open up the hips, be able to sink into the position. Now if you were to keep the feet straight forward, knees go in, you're just gonna have nowhere to go with the squat. If you were to open the knees out, you'll have a lot of space. Now this can happen, so if the foot is forward and you're trying to externally rotate, you're actually putting a little twist on the knee. So you have to watch overly externally rotating if the foot is forward. Sometimes you wanna turn the feet out and get better tracking with the knee over the foot, just more in line, so we're not twisting the knee, and then you're giving yourself some space in the hip. Then there's also the fact of some people going through overly externally rotating and keeping the hips out. And that can cause a problem because you're gonna find that it's gonna be very difficult to then push yourself out of the position. One of the most common things I have been seeing lately is people putting their feet forward and just going forward with the knees. So they're just tracking forward. They're not necessarily opening up the hips, creating space and sinking into the squat. Now this can change when you're going through a high versus a low bar squat because a lot of times you're going more up and down in the high bar and then the low bar you're hinging back. So what I personally do in the squat is I go through a phase of externally rotating with a nice hip hinge, and I can get a lot of clearance in the hips, I can get a lot of good depth, and then as I go to push, there's a phase where I start to drive in. Some people have a flow pattern where they pop in, they pop out, and they drive right into that valgus, and they start pushing out of the hole, and you can do that as well. But if you find a good sinking position, this is why pause squats can be a very good technical challenge for you to try to practice on this. Externally rotate, get into the hole, sink into it, pause for a second, find the point where you're starting to drive in and push out, and then drive, find midline, don't over accentuate that, don't overly collapse, and then go through a phase where you're starting to extend the hips and drive through the glutes and slightly externally rotate. Try not to make these too over accentuated, but you also could try over accentuating some of these to find that position and what works best for you. So it's just a practice of where do I open my knees and where do I close them down. You don't always necessarily have to think about what's happening at the hip level. You could just think about where do my knees go. So if I'm opening the knees, you are externally rotating the hip. If I'm closing them down, you are internally rotating the hip. So open, externally rotate, find space down at the bottom, close it down, try to push out, find good stability and leverage there, and then find a phase where you're starting to extend, just slight external rotation, and drive through and see if that works for you. If it doesn't, then you might want to change the foot position, change your stance, width. You could open your hips more, you could open your hips less, you can close them down a little sooner. There's so many things that you can do here. There's no right or wrong to this, but it's just trying to understand that you do need to create rotation so that you have better positioning in the squat and you have better leverage and force production to get yourself out of the squat so you're not keeping them out and getting stuck. This is where the whole debate came from, keeping the knees out, not driving in, the over collapse of valgus. It just gets really, really confusing. I think you should just find a point that works best for you through opening and closing. And for the most part, that's the phase of externally rotating, internally rotating, back to some external rotation. Test the waters as far as where you want to try to open and close the hips and just kind of see what works best. There's so many things that you can do here. Give that a shot. Let me know what you guys think. I'll check you on the next one.